Ladies and gentlemen, Esau Kamara, lecturer at Frobe College, University of Sierra Leone. I'm here again this afternoon to lecture dissertation writing. How to write your dissertation. It is part of the academic exercise, and it's a requirement for your degree, for even also postgraduates. This particular lecture will also be beneficial and useful to those postgraduate students. I started off with chapter 1. In our previous class, I dealt with chapter 1. I'm here today to lecture on chapters 2 and 3. But I may want to give a recap of what we did in our previous class, that is specifically chapter 1, to give you a preamble of chapter 1. In other words, what chapter 1 entails. I said the first thing you have to note is your research topic. The topic should be researchable. You have to test the hypothesis of your dissertation with respect to your specific objectives. If your topic is not researchable, you will find it difficult to write a dissertation. So in the first place, before starting, you have to ensure that your topic is being approved by your supervisor or lecturer. So chapter 1 specifically is short, but it has some segments or variables that we have to consider purely when writing it. As I said, normally you start with numbering. Some people will start with 1.0, some will start with 1.1. What is important here is you start with your introduction. I said some people start normally with background of the study. But background of the study is part of your introduction. And I told you that your introduction, what entails your introduction, you have to define the concept. If you are talking, for example, about an examination of the causes of prostitution in the western part of Freetown, you must have to define that concept, prostitution. And you must also have to trace how it came about, what it means, its inception, the trend of it, how it started. If you are talking about England or New World, where slaves were taken to, the New World, Britain, Germany, etc., etc. And as a result of their deplorable conditions, they were sent back in Africa. So, in fact, prostitution started specifically in England because of those slaves who were manhandled and their deplorable conditions. As a result of that, we are sent to Africa, settled down. Prostitution still continues. So you have to give what you call a link or a trend of the concept, its inception, and how it came about, its impact, or we look at the causes and impact on the society, and you may also draw a conclusion. Your introduction, you are not supposed to quote extensively scholars or the names of scholars and what they have written. That is meant for chapter 2. What should entail in your introduction is you are just giving a summary of the background of the topic with respect to the causes, effects, and perhaps also draw your conclusion. So therefore, your introduction should not exceed, as said, more than 2 pages. Then you go to your statement of the problem. You identify the gaps, and you have to explain as a researcher why you have decided, to take or select that particular topic. That is your statement of problem. It should be followed immediately after your introduction. It should not exceed more than 2 pages. From there, I say you go to aim/objectives. Getting that wrong from your objectives. You formulate the objectives you stated to your research questions. From there, I say you go to delimitation and limitations of the study. Delimitation tells you about the area you are going to cover. Your case study, if you are talking about Freetown, for example, you give a short background of Freetown. Now, Freetown is the capital city of Sierra Leone. You look at a geographical situation, demography especially. You look at the dominant tribes living in that particular locality, Freetown. You look at their activities. Then at least you have to attach a map on it. I explained that one. Limitations, I say you have to bring about problems you encounter. You cannot talk about lack of finance, lack of transportations. They are something that you can combat, and it's inevitable. You must have to encounter them. You talk about problems that you found very difficult to resolve. Like, for example, this COVID-19 could be one of the problems you encounter in your research. If you are talking about strikes or riots in a particular university or campus, you are undertaking a research, that could be an impediment. Those are obstacles you must have to outline because you could not control or combat them. I said from there you go to significance of the study, or some people will say justification of the study. How justifiable your study is. You look at three variables. You look at the society, the respondent in the society, and you look at other sectors, government departments, and even also your own department. That, for example, the dissertation will be useful to what? Ministry of Education, Social Welfare, or you are talking about Ministry of Education or tertiary, or you are talking about social welfare. How useful also it will also be to other society, to the government, and even also to your department as a reference point. You have to discuss those soon. So that tells you about significance of the study. From there, I say you talk about clarification of terms. It's not definition of terms. That phrase has been modified. It's now clarification of terms. You clarify those major terms, terminologies that you may encounter in your research. For example, if you are talking about prostitution in the western part of Freetown, you must have to define prostitution. That tells you the fundamental departure now with social sciences and other disciplines. For example, also in medical, commerce, they have to make use of their medical dictionary. But if you are in the social science stream, unlike law, you have to use Oxford Dictionary. You talk about prostitution, you define just precise. You are not going to explain all about prostitution, just a dictionary meaning, which is Oxford. You look at also, for example, victims. You explain sexually harassed. What does that mean? Those terms you have to break them using dictionary. If you are a medical person or you are in commerce, you use your medical dictionary. That is a point of departure with other disciplines. If you are law, you use also a legal dictionary, a law dictionary. For example, if you want to talk about like a situation like drafting, pleadings, you must have to get a dictionary, legal dictionary meaning, or AFRE, or as the case may be, or jurisdiction, you must have to use a law dictionary. So definite clarification of terms, really, that is the end of chapter 1. Some people will go beyond to look at structure of the dissertation. I say it's not relevant because structure of this dissertation, they are summarizing all what they have written in chapter 1. Some of them will even proceed to the other chapter. That is not important in that area because you have to write your summary in chapter 5. Summary, conclusion, and recommendations. So don't bring structure of the dissertation again to summarize. It's relevant because you are bringing that one in chapter 5. These were some of the bullet points I discussed in chapter 1. Now specifically we are going to chapter 2, which is the literature review. Literature review is all about giving views, pertinent scholars, what pertinent scholars have contributed to the topic you are writing. Some people will say, oh, but my topic, I have a virgin topic that I have not got any literature on it. No, something else, even an article must have written about that particular topic. So you will not entirely say my topic is virgin, or there is no literature review on that. Articles may also help you. Journals may also help you. Reports, records, all those things, they are very important. In fact, when you come to look at your primary source of data in chapter 3. So what is important here in chapter 2? You are giving the views, hypothetical views of scholars with respect to the topic. You are researching your topic that is researchable. before you. You are giving what scholars have said with respect to that topic. For example, if you are talking about the causes of prostitution in the western part of Sierra Leone, or you are talking about the contribution of Methodist mission to selected Methodist secondary schools in Freetown, a case study selected schools, you must have to look at some literature reviews, some literature scholars that are written, or articles that are all about that particular contribution. So you have to find your literature review. Now, literature review is just like referencing those scholars. But the mistake some students normally do is that they go to old dissertations, old textbooks, and plagiarize directly. That is literature review. Literature review always leaves what you call sort of gaps or rooms for criticism. You have to critique the views of those scholars, bring in your own contribution. That helps tremendously in enhancing the potentiality or the credibility of the literature review you are writing on. You cannot just plagiarize. But there is a room, gaps are there that you might critique the views of those scholars. That makes the dissertation distinct, very different, from what others normally copy directly from the text. Now, you are giving the views of pertinent scholars with respect to the topic, your stated topic. Now, what is important, or you start with your introduction, 2.1 or 2.2, as the case may be. Short introduction, perhaps 2 paragraphs, or sometimes, if I prefer, 1 paragraph, writing about 4 sentences. You can start, for example, by saying, Chapter 2 presents pertinent literature review with respect to the stated objectives below. Now, what is important here, you have to restate those 5 objectives you have earlier on identified in your chapter 1. So, you are now going to give the views of scholars with respect to those objectives, the 5 objectives. For example, you have to restate them. Chapter 2 presents pertinent literature review with respect to the stated objectives below. You state them in the form of bullet point. Don't number them. 1, to identify. You state the one of the objective. 2, to examine. 3, to discuss. 4, you state all those 5 objectives in your introduction. Because you have to re-examine them with respect to scholars and your own personal contribution of what those scholars have said. So you restate them. That makes a difference with just going to copy from directly from a dissertation. So that is why sometimes we can easily identify if a student has copied from an old dissertation, or somebody has written an article on a long essay. We can easily identify by that, because your dissertation has to be unique in the sense you restate all the 5 objectives. You are going to re-examine them properly with respect to the views of scholars. So when you have identified 5 of them, interestingly, you are just taking 4 to discuss them in detail, one after the other. Remember, as I told you, that the 5th objective, which is the last objective, always tells you about appropriate remedies to be adopted in minimizing the problem. That is always the last objective. It is there that to identify appropriate remedies in minimizing prostitution in the western part of Freetown. So that appropriate remedies or solutions should not be discussed in chapter 2. You have to take it later in chapter 5 under recommendations, but you have to state it in chapter 2. So sometimes some students may state all the 5 objectives and discuss, but the last objective, which is about solutions or recommendations or remedy, should not be discussed in that chapter 2. You have to discuss it in chapter 5 under recommendations. You have chapter 5, summary, conclusion, recommendation. So you always transfer the last objective to recommendations. So as I said, you have to state all the 5 objectives in your introduction. That is for chapter 2 specifically. You restate the objectives that you identify or you have identified earlier in chapter 1. That is under 1.3. which tells you about the objectives of the study. You have to restate them, because critically you are going to re-examine them with respect to what scholars have said, the hypothetical views. They must have inferred hypothetical views on those objectives. But I said the last objective, which is always the solution, identify appropriate solution or remedies. To identify appropriate solutions or remedies in minimizing the rate of prostitution in the western part of Freetown. Let's say that is your recommendation, and that is your fifth or final objective. That final objective, you should not discuss the solutions of that remedy in chapter 2. It has to be transferred in chapter 5 under recommendations. You have a room for that. Recommendations for further study. That is what you are proposing or suggesting for other scholars or other learners, to adopt or to have solution. So the 5 you have already outlined or restated in your chapter 2 as an introduction. You are taking 4 objectives, 1, 2, 3, 4. You have to discuss them critically. Now, after listing those 5 objectives, that is your 2.1 introduction. By saying, I echo it, this chapter presents pertinent literature review with respect to the objectives stated below. You give bullet point. 1, to identify, you state. 2, to examine, you state. 3, to discuss. 4, to elucidate. 5, to identify appropriate recommendations or remedies in minimizing prostitution in Sierra Leone. After listing those 5 objectives, you can now go to 2.2. You take first objective there. You have identified earlier. You are taking it to be now 2.2. You have to start working on that now. 2.2. Using that one objective, you have to now quote the views of scholars, the literature they have written with respect to that particular objective. You can bring even articles, dissertations, even on publish. You can write it on publish. You quote the name. Now you can identify in the first place the surname of the scholar, date. Then, if there is a book written by that scholar, you identify the book and the year. For example, I will start by saying, Anderson in 2017, to Anderson in bracket 2016, stated in his book, The Efficacy of Law on the Society, quotation mark close, or in quotation mark, said, you bring the quotation. What did he say? So you have to identify the scholar, the date of publication, you put it in bracket. You identify the textbook, or if it is an article, then what also that particular scholar inferred with respect to that particular topic. But what is so pertinent about literature review is this. Quote recent dates. Normally, the recent method is it should be ranged from 10 to the present year we are now. It should be 10 years. For example, if you are quoting the scholar's name, make sure that the book you are talking about is recent. Take it to be the range of 10 years. For example, this is 2020. So you should start, normally the range should be 2010 to 2020. Do not bring books or scholars who have written in 17th centuries, in 17th, 18th centuries, or even 19th century. They are not compatible to the research you are doing. Simply because those books might have been reviewed by other scholars in the recent times. So that is why you have to bring recent books. If you are talking about books that are written 30 years back, Don't bring them, because those books might have been reviewed not by that particular scholar but by other scholars. The books might have been reviewed. So that is why it's good to bring recent dates. But there are exceptions to that rule. What are the exceptions? One, you may have renowned scholars, prominent scholars, even though they are written in the 14th, 15th centuries, their ideas, their views are still prominent. We cannot isolate them, irrespective of the fact that their books have not been reviewed, but they are prominent in our society. For example, you talk about Shakespeare. Shakespeare, the book is so old, but we reckon with Shakespeare because he's a prominent writer. He was a prominent writer. Everybody in the society, we have heard of Shakespeare, even somebody in primary school. So that's the view of Shakespeare, even though we cannot say archaic or outdated, but even though the book has been written or his own philosophy or his own statement has been said long years, we have to reckon with him because he was a great scholar. So we reckon with philosophers who are so prominent. Shakespeare, Woyisuika, Chinua Achebe, and the like of it. Even though their books have not been reviewed, but they are prominent scholars, philosophers that we have to reckon their opinion, their views with respect to the topic. So those are exceptions given to those people. You can bring also vital reports. Reports, books unpublished, but yet they serve as profound contribution or tremendous contribution to your dissertation. Those exceptions, you have to bring them, even though they are not within the range of 10 to the present year 2020. So as I said, 2.2, the first objective. As I said, the first objective, 2.2, you can discuss that one perhaps using 3 pages with respect to the views of scholars. Quote, as I said, Anderson, for example, in 2014, in his book, The Appalling Effect of Prostitution on the Society. Yes, he continued with what he said. You can give one objective about 3 or 4 pages. There are gaps you may have identified in the literature review. You have that responsibility to fill in those gaps. You can critique that particular objective by giving your contribution. That makes a difference with other literature review. That tells you exactly that your work is creative and you are so innovative, you are bringing new ideas in the literature review. A room is here. There's a room provided for that. Then you can go 2.3, which is your second objective. For example, the causes of appalling effects of prostitution on the society. You can write literature review also equally about 3 pages. Then you go to 2.4. If you are talking about other like challenges, you can write about that one about 3-4 pages. That is your third objective. 2.4. 5. You look at now, for example, the challenges. 2.4. Then the 2.5, I said you should not discuss it, or the 2.6, which is your recommendations, which we refer to as what? Remedies. You should not discuss. So at least your literature review, you have to quote, the views of potential scholars who have contributed immensely to the stated objectives. You have to be so accurate, precise, and very analytical in your research. You critique where it is necessary. So literature is giving pertinent views of scholars. So you identify the 5 objectives, but you have to discuss 4 of them. Then some students might ask, sometimes, even after discussing, there is a room there also, let's say 2.7, general discussion or discussion. Or summary of chapter 2. Some of them write summary of chapter 2, or they will just write summary. You are not supposed to summarize chapter 2 again, because there is a room provided in chapter 5, summary, conclusion and recommendation. You can bring that under summary 5.2 summary. So some people will say my lecturer or my supervisor said I should summarize chapter 2. It's not relevant in that case. You can close your chapter 2 now by giving one statement to summarize all what you have said, but not putting it separate as summary of chapter 2. But diplomatically, you can do that one by summarizing all what you have said. That is the end of chapter 2. Precisely. So, some may ask, how many pages chapter 2 should contain? No, it depends on your stated objectives. It depends on what you have researched. It depends on your topic. It could be 15 pages, it could be 10 pages, it could be 12 pages, but you are writing a quality dissertation. You cannot write something so voluminous or so bulky as your literature review, giving, for example, 70 pages. How do you think your supervisor is going to mark 70 pages alone for literature review? That is condemned. It should be so precise, to the point. It should entail relevant point of the views of scholars with respect to that particular topic. Now, specifically, some may ask questions, 2-3 questions, that yes, is it good always to bring footnotes, even starting from your introduction to that of chapter 2. Some are so particular with chapter 2. Footnote is optional. I will say it again, it's optional. But as far as I'm concerned, footnote is outdated. Why? Footnote, you are making reference to what you have quoted already. Some in fact start giving footnotes from the beginning, your introduction. But they are more concerned with footnotes in chapter 2. Years back, I did my own dissertation. I had a footnote. That one was correct. That is about 20 years back. But now, even today, this is a modern world. We have what we call at the back of dissertation references, or what we call bibliography. So if you are giving footnote, you are going to transfer that footnote again to your references or bibliography, which is duplication of the work. So I don't see it important, neither even necessary or essential, to give footnotes from the beginning of your introduction and that of your chapter 2. Because you are mandated as one of the requirements to reference the scholars, reference books, authors. You have identified in chapters 1, you have identified in chapter 2, chapters 1, 2, 4, and even 5. So why do you have to give footnotes? You are duplicating and adding more burden to the students. In fact, some students are confused how they should go about footnotes. It's so technical. But to ease the work, modern society said now, we don't normally use to reference. So even when you are giving footnote, you are going to reference them chronologically also in your reference. So I always prefer that you give me a reference or bibliography of all what you have written with reference to those authorities, with reference to scholars, with reference to other commentators. So that is, as far as I'm concerned, once more, it is optional. But I prefer always you give reference. Do not duplicate the work on student. So chapter 2 specifically is optional. You can give footnotes from even chapter 1. But what is important here, you always end with summary of all what you have written. That is what chapter 2 entails.